Sarah, can you hear us?
Yes, I can. Hi.
Perfect. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for your film. We wish you could be here in person, but it's a pleasure to have you on the screen behind me.
Yes, I'm feeling the same way. I really wish that I were there, but I'm also so appreciative of being able to be there virtually. So thank you so much for having me and for having our film.
So I'll just remind the audience, I'm here for a conversation with Sarah, but she's also here for a conversation with you. If you have any questions at any time, please wave or raise your hands and we'll be delighted to fold them to the conversation. Se tu tens preferência para falar português, não é o problema, eu posso traduzir para Sarah também. So, Sarah, let's start at the beginning. And maybe if we can start with you describing the genesis of this film and this project. I know you have an illustrious and awarded career as a filmmaker, but this is also your first independent feature production, I believe. So maybe we can talk about the forces that led you to this story in particular.
Yes. Well, so I, like many people after the election, the presidential election in the United States in 2016, would spend a lot of time trying to make sense of what had happened. And as a filmmaker, I feel like the way to make sense of things is to figure out making a film. That's kind of what we do, as a documentary filmmaker. And I had the opportunity to develop a project while I was finishing another film. And I mentioned the other film because the other film was about the Gilded Age, which is the period in the United States in the 1880s and 1890s where the United States went from sort of an agrarian society to a fully industrialized country. And it was a time of great income inequality and disparity between the rich and the poor. And so I was making that history film, which is what I've been doing a lot of in my career, is making history films. And I had this chance to think about, well, what kind of a film would I make about what has just happened politically? And so the film kind of grew out of that, and it grew out of this reading a lot about what had happened and what did a populist movement actually mean, and how was Donald Trump in some ways the symptom of a much larger issue that has been growing in the United States for the past 30 and 40 years. So that's sort of where it all kind of started.
I'm really glad you brought up the Gilded Age project, actually, because, of course, your film is screening as part of a section of Doclisboa that's devoted to a reflection and refraction of issues related to work and labor, kind of really looking at how they act as prisms for us to understand the world and the forces that shape it. And, of course, the Gilded Age really describes the Second Industrial Revolution, and your film is very much looking so closely at the third, or what people have termed the third industrial revolution that we're in the midst of today. So it'd be interesting to hear you maybe expand upon this a little more in terms of this aspect of mirroring the present. I know the motivation for the Gilded Age was also to act as a kind of mirror for our present reality. And I think it's something that Disrupted also does so well.
Thank you. Well, I think that they're really closely related, the two films, and I have to say it was not done on purpose. I didn't actually realize it until partway through working on the Disrupted, how closely aligned the ideas were. The Gilded Age film that I made was for American public television here, and I talked to a lot of scholars and historians who we often talk about the second Gilded Age in the United States. And so it really, I had all this background, I guess, having worked on that film to then go into working on this film, which, we had a working title for a long time just because it took us a while to get to the title, The Disrupted. And so we were calling it as a kind of very sort of basic title that we knew wouldn't be the final title. We called it American Dreams, because it was kind of like, what is it that we expect? What do we want? And thinking about your labor and sort of the value of your labor has a lot to do with how we define who we are. And then the other aspect that was so relevant to the first film, about the film I did about the Gilded Age, is this notion of feeling like you're doing everything you can and you're working so hard and putting so much of yourself into your work, but you're not seeing results in terms of being able to get ahead or having enough. And I think it's very American feeling of being sort of so individualistic that like we're all on our own and we're all going to make it. And this sort of American ideal of this sort of entrepreneur, it doesn't make any sense for a lot of reasons in the current economy and for a lot of people in the United States. And so that was a theme that really came through for us, which is that we picked these people from, they don't ever meet, they don't know each other, they have nothing to do with each other, but they have so much in common, and yet they don't necessarily realize that.
Mm. I'd love it if you might be able to talk a little bit more about the casting process, actually. The film acts by interweaving these three incredibly intimate personal stories, and through that builds a really quite devastating argument and depiction of the problems, or many problems that people are facing within the current free market global economy, we could say. But the balance and simpatico between these characters is quite astonishing, or how they're able to build and branch into this. So maybe if you could talk us through the process of finding these characters, or and how they came to, how you found them.
Yeah, I mean, it was really interesting and took a lot of work and a lot of research and a lot of kind of, I would say, sort of journalistic work, reporting work. And I brought in a partner on this project named Josh Gleason, who did a tremendous amount. Part of the reason I brought him in was that he had a lot more experience than I did in terms of really like finding stories and going out and doing sort of all the sort of shoe leather work of reporting. And so we had sort of ideas of the kinds of people we were looking for. I was very determined to have a farmer in the film, and that was partially just a visual idea that I just felt like cinematically a farmer would just give us lots of beautiful material, which I think he did. But also this sort of getting to some ideals of American ideas, like farming is, everybody has this feeling that they're somehow connected to being a farmer, but nobody actually is a farmer in the United States anymore. So and then the manufacturing idea was kind of an obvious one in the aftermath of the Trump election. Mm-hmm. And then the really great idea that Josh brought to the table brought to me was this notion of the gig economy. Like, let's look at somebody working in the gig economy. And I think that was just a really key idea that really brought things together. Now, we did follow a few more people than ended up in the film. So initially, we also followed a teacher, and we followed a first-time politician. And ultimately, within the first sort of 6 months, we dropped the politician and the teacher, although we made a short film about the politician called True Believer, which you can actually see online. If anyone's interested, it's on the Atlantic site, the Atlantic magazine in the United States. You can go there, and it's called True Believer.
Oh, that's super interesting. Whilst you were talking, I was wondering whether those characters metastated into something else as well. But I mean, it's a great amount of trust, of course, on your behalf, or belief, I guess, when finding and essentially casting these three characters. I believe the process of making the film lasted, was it a 2-year process, I believe?
Yeah, it was 2 years of filming. It was 3 years really from start to finish, but we filmed for about 2 years.
Mm-hmm. And I guess, obviously, at the gestation of this project, you knew the kind of reality you were interested in investigating and describing, but they're very personal stories that over those 2 years could have gone in numerous different directions. So I'd like to also talk with you about the process of how the film maybe changed through the reality of living with these characters for that period of time, and how they impacted on the film's argument, in essence.
Yes, I mean, it was obviously like a huge leap to sort of pick the subjects and then kind of wait and see what happened. And of course, that was something I've always wanted to do as a filmmaker. And it's not that easy to get the chance to do that, in terms of just funding and all of that. So this was a sort of really great opportunity, but totally nerve-wracking. I mean, we picked the subjects because they all had interesting they were all in important turning point moments in their lives, but we really didn't know what was going to happen next. But we liked them. I mean, and they had they brought something to the table that was sort of interesting because of their personality, but also their situation. For example, Cheryl, who the Uber driver, in addition to the fact that there aren't that many women who drive it's sort of a dangerous job as a woman. So there are many fewer women. So she was interesting in that way. But she was also interesting because she was really determined to organize drivers. And she felt very angry at what was happening to, this job. And she wanted to do something about it. So she was not just driving, she had like a purpose. So each character had something that we kind of hoped would lead us somewhere. But I have to say, throughout the whole process, there were times when we were worried, not enough had happened. Is this going to just be so boring and flat? And I have to credit our editor. We had worked with an amazing editor named Lynn True, and she really, these projects, any documentary film is an enormous collaborative effort. And Lynn brought a whole level of talent and understanding of the material that we needed at the point that she joined the project and helped us kind of make sense of the three stories.
Does anyone have anything they want to add to the conversation? Any questions at this moment? There's one at the back. I'm going to have to relay this to you, Sarah, because of my...
Of course.
So the question is, the gentleman saying he's curious about how the film being inspired by the last election, and then of course that period of time having passed afterwards. That's more or less the right. So yeah, talking about the film being instigated by the last election, another crossroads in essence. And then I think it's something I've been thinking about a lot as well, thinking that of course we're just 1 week today away from another election. So maybe reflecting back on the project, I guess, over what has or has not changed in the States, or how you feel the film actually performs, what role the film performs in this present reality.
Well, I think we always hoped and planned to have the film come out before the next election, because it felt like it would be provocative for people. But one of the things that we were pretty determined about, both Josh and I, both having kind of come from journalistic backgrounds and feeling like we were not interested in making a strongly partisan film, that we wanted to make a film that would hopefully, I mean, this was pre-pandemic, a film that was going to bring people in and create conversation. So we imagined that over the last couple of months, we would be having screenings all over the Midwest and possibly in Florida and different states where people are talking about these issues and are often really politicized. The issues are, pushing people apart, and the notion that this film could actually bring people together to talk about solutions. So in other words, see the film and then maybe have a panel discussion with experts and policymakers and politicians to sort of talk about, well, what can we do about these kinds of problems? Unfortunately, because of the pandemic, in-person events have not been possible, but we have been doing an impact campaign here in the United States. We're doing a bunch of events last week and this week, doing exactly what I've just described, but doing it virtually, using Zoom and different platforms to have these kinds of conversations virtually. So it definitely, in our mind, was always something that could be a conversation starter in the lead up to the next presidential election.
Thank you. Any other questions from the audience at this point? Then I'd maybe like to continue talking about the film's politics, I guess, in essence. I think it's extremely successful at avoiding its partisan stance. I find it in a very emotionally affecting film, actually, the stories, and especially maybe Don's story in particular. I think there's something, he's a character that feels really full of pathos, and especially this idea of losing potentially 100 years of land that's been in the family for over 100 years. and we avoid the kind of big P politics, but we do get two moments within the film that kind of bracket, I guess, the film and introduce the bigger picture. We get this glimpse of Trump on the television towards the film's end, announcing his plan and funding for the war. But I think even more effectively than that, there's this beautiful scene with Don when he's sitting in front of the statue of Roosevelt, when he says it would just be so wonderful to have another Roosevelt here with us. And I think in both of those instances, particularly this scene with Don, one of the real strengths of the film is the way that the characters end up actually voicing the film's own thesis, right? I think this scene in particular is effective, is incredibly moving for that. And I'd just maybe like to talk again a little bit more to you about staying bipartisan, I guess, or avoiding polemics whilst dealing with an issue that is so hot.
Yes, well, it was, I mean, I think we felt, Trump himself is so polarizing. And even just seeing his image, we talked a lot about whether we should use that footage or not of him on the television. And ultimately I wanted to, because I felt like what this film is, if it's nothing else, it's a kind of document of the present reality in America. So, if it just records something, I hope that it just leaves like there's a way that it's almost like a diary of what happened over the last 2 years. And to do a diary right now and not even have any mention of Trump seemed, crazy. I just felt like he had to be there. I felt like, the Roosevelt moment to me, I've always loved that sequence. And I have to say it was in the film and then it was out of the film. And it was one of those things where we kept struggling to, and I was determined to keep it in the film. I'm so glad you like it. That makes me really happy. Because I think he does voice sort of what I think a lot of people are feeling and thinking. And I also think it's interesting that he's choosing Teddy Roosevelt, because Teddy Roosevelt is a really interesting politician in American history. And he is the response to the Gilded Age. Teddy Roosevelt comes along after the Gilded Age and starts breaking up monopolies and doing all sorts of things like he brings on the progressive era, which is many things we still live with in the United States because of Teddy Roosevelt. So it's a very apt thing to say that Don says.
Yeah. No, and it feels. Can I ask you what your concerns were about the scene then, in terms of it being a delicate scene to leave in or take out?
Well, I think with that one, it was less worrying too much about the politics. I mean, these are all sort of technicalities. I mean, Teddy Roosevelt's a Republican. It doesn't show any really clear political persuasion by talking about Teddy Roosevelt. But I just think, this film was very, as you might imagine, it was incredibly delicate, sort of the kind of how to weave the three stories and how much of each story you needed. And so there were a lot of moments where certain things like, okay, what happens when we remove that sequence? Or what if we move it here? And how does that change how things feel? And just like any filmmaking editing process, it's always very delicate, but somehow this was particularly so, because you have these three characters, again, who have nothing to do with each other, and you're trying to get them to sort of tell a story together.
And it's also, I mean, the film also is very impressive in that, given how divided America is at present, the characters' own politics remain outside of the frame throughout the entire film. And I think that's, given the amount of noise in America about so many of these issues, I think that's both a very skillful and tactful feat to have achieved. But I'd also like to ask, I guess, to what extent you felt that your characters were aware of the film's project as a whole, or how you kind of explained and worked with your characters to build the film's argument, I guess, to some extent. I'm rambling slightly, but I think.
No, it's such a good question, because, we were calling the film American Dreams, and what, and the film's argument in some ways it unfolded for us. You know what I mean? We sort of had a sense of the issues we were interested in, but it was kind of how would it all play out. I think for Don, the farmer, you know, his wife and several other people close to him really didn't want him to participate in the film. And he made a decision, a very conscious decision to be part of the film because he wanted other small farmers to know that they were not alone. And so for him, it's a huge, huge deal that he admitted that he has that debt. And when I went to show him the film in January of this year, that's the one thing he felt anxious about, that he had admitted how much debt he has on the farm. Mm-hmm. And of course, but it's also the most important thing that he reveals because it shows how impossible it is to be in his position. And we did do one in-person screening in Kansas at a drive-in movie theater, and it was hosted by a farmers organization, and many people came up to Don afterwards and just thanked him for being honest about what's really going on. And so this sense of not being alone, I think Don really knew that he needed to share his struggles to help other people. I think Pete and Cheryl were, you know, Pete being the former manufacturing worker, he says that when he was sort of asked to be part of the film, he wanted to really screw 3M. You know, his purpose for being part of the film was to just like really show those corporate people, you know, be really angry. And then of course it became something very different for him in the process of the filmmaking. I think it was very therapeutic for Pete and for Melissa in some ways, to have me showing up and having like a not safe space, but like a private space to talk about things. Because we did a bunch of audio interviews over the course of the filmmaking, and we only used a very little bit of that, but it was long conversations of just one-on-one with a sound person. We didn't film them.
Any questions? Anyone here or anyone want to join the conversation in that way? Then maybe, I mean, having talked about the characters, I'd also like to talk about the presence of children actually in the film. I find it a really interesting way of emphasizing this idea of the current of history, I guess, right? We have both Pete's son and his journey, but also, of course, Don's two children and their struggles over the farm. And I'd like to maybe ask you about that as well, because I think the idea of the characters being at a crossroads, America perhaps being at a crossroads, the world being at a crossroads. And I find it very interesting the way that the children are also folded into this conversation, maybe as an illustration of the potentials of these decisions that we take at the present.
Well, it really became clear to us as we were filming that for both Don and Pete, it was a real father-son story that was unfolding for us. And especially in the Pete circumstances, you know, when we first started filming, his son Alex was just a little 11-year-old boy playing baseball kind of, and running around and looking very angelic and sweet. And over the course of the 2 years, Alex went through some really hard, difficult times that coincided with growing up. I mean, and, you know, physically changing, and his, you know, entering middle school, which, you know, the sort of very tough years of middle school, 12 and 13 years old. So Alex especially was really, really hard to figure out. You know, we spent a lot of time thinking about what was fair to Alex and being careful with Alex, because the last thing we wanted to do would be to hurt Alex in any way with the film. And Pete and Melissa were very open about letting us film, but we also felt like a big responsibility to what was going on for Alex. Mm-hmm. I feel like with Don and his kids, you know, it became so clear that the story was all about, what am I leaving for the next generation? How am I gonna make things right for them? And I think Don, you know, in so many ways is a really amazingly aware parent, you know, because he's sort of aware that he's got this burden that he's leaving for his kids, and he doesn't want it to be a burden, and yet he loves the farm more than anything in the world, and he wants his kids to want to take it over. So it's like this push and pull over what to do. I mean, for me, I really thought that was very important. obviously important aspect of the story.
Any questions? If anyone does, just wave. Then I'd maybe just like to, we haven't got much time left, but I'd like to maybe kind of wrap up the conversation slightly by asking again about this parallel between America and the world at large. I think you were talking about the initial working title being American Dreamers, right? I think you said?
Yes, yeah.
And then we also get, there's this an extraordinarily bittersweet moment within the film, I think, when you are hanging out with your protagonists over the 4th of July. And fireworks burst in the background, 4th of July, of course, being Independence Day. But more than anything, what this film describes is a trap, basically, right? Or an economic trap that many find themselves within at the moment. Yet at the same time, I think watching this film over in Portugal, and I'm sure around the rest of the world as well, describes a situation that feels that we all feel very close to globally as well. So I'd maybe like to ask you about the balance, or whether that was a consideration within the film in terms of it offering both a portrait of to what extent you saw the film as a portrait of America, I guess, and to what extent you see it as a portrait of, well, the global situation that we find ourselves in.
I mean, I think that, we were well, I feel like Americans are very self-absorbed. So we were very aware of it being an American portrait. But I have to say, it also, all the issues, they're issues of like globalization, they're issues of changing economies, and how do you make change? When technology comes in, how do you both positively move forward but mourn the past and kind of move forward with the times? And I think the characters or the subjects that we chose are all very positive people who were, ready, at 45 and 50 and 60, like still, ready to reinvent themselves as needed. And I think that's something that's very universal. The people in the film are universal. And this sort of thinking about labor and the value of your labor is a universal human experience. So hopefully first of all, we're so grateful that you accepted us into your festival, and it means so much to, and I would speak for Josh here as well, that you're talking about the film, that you've shown the film. We're just so grateful. It's very exciting to think of you in Portugal watching it.
Well, thank you. We're very happy to have had the film and delighted to be able to have seen it in a cinema as well. I would just like everyone to join me in thanking SARAH COLT then for your time and for joining us in your film. And to just wrap up with one final question about whether you can tell us anything about what your next project is. I know sometimes these things are secrets. But...
I know. I wish that I'm doing another history film, but it's more 20th century. It's good. It's a good one. I'm in the middle of the edit room, so my editor's waiting for me to get off of here and get back to him. But I can't tell you what it is, but it'll be out in the spring.
Okay, we look forward to it. Well, given that this is a film about work, we'll let you get back to work as well. Thank you so much, SARAH COLT.
Thank you.